What does it mean to master the game of life? Like any game, it requires a fundamental understanding and application of the rules. But living in today's on-demand society is making this nearly impossible, as our attention is increasingly being fought over and monetized by others. Will Moore's mission is to help you hit the reset button by providing a new set of game rules based on time-proven universal principles and modern science. To gamify your life by making it fun and addictive to replace your habits in the 5 core areas of your life proven to lead to true happiness. Ready, player one?
Well, thank you so much for being on here. We'll leave the intro that I just gave. Just to sum up again, I couldn't be more excited and geeked out to have a behavioral scientist on here that actually gets and understands the fact that, hey, we can use our brains for good instead of evil. Like, why aren't we doing it more? And it all revolves around habits and having fun and making life a game. And obviously that's what my channel and everything I talk about is, and how life doesn't have to be so hard, and you can trick your little lizard brain into doing certain things and gaining momentum and having fun in life and experiencing that stuff we all loved when we were kids, when we used to play games a lot more. So welcome. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I was, checking out your 5 cores, and certainly it sounds like we speak the same language.
Yeah, I was looking into you. I haven't read your book yet. I know it just came out right in January.
That's right, a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Congratulations. But
I
read the synopsis and, kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit. And I can't wait to dive into it. So, I mean, first off, let's just get a little bit of a background on you. What led you, let's give me the 3-minute version of what got you to here, and, what made you write this book and why you're focused on this stuff. And then let's talk about the book and where you're headed moving forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the short version is I've been interested in the science of happiness for quite some time. International charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. So when that started to form around 2006. For folks that don't know what positive psychology is, it's essentially a facet of psychology where we use psychological tools for betterment rather than treating deficits. So up until that point, psychology had been primarily used to, treat mental illness. And so around the turn of the millennium, folks that are familiar with flow, Csikszentmihalyi's book got really popular, and then another gentleman by the name of Marty Seligman released a book called Authentic Happiness, and we were kind of off to the races. Right now we talk about positive psychology quite a bit. And so again, long story short, what happened to me is that I had been using all those tools fairly effectively up until about 2016, where I had realized that I had essentially over-optimized my life for happiness. Like, I had chased it so hard that essentially I ground myself into the ground. My younger brother passed away quite suddenly, and because I had this emphasis on always wanting to be happy, that was, an interesting experience where I was trying to will myself out of, processing that and not creating the space.
Interesting.
And then I'd been an endurance athlete up until that point, and these two things aren't related, but a couple of months later found out that I had injured my hip and was going to need, at a fairly young age, a hip replacement. And so my identity as a runner was essentially smashed into pieces. And so I was having to rebuild that. And so long story short, again, okay, so that's great. Like, all these tools that I had, I kind of realized that they were now maladaptive with regards to living a good life. And, but that didn't leave me much room to kind of move on. Right. And, my doctoral work had been in autonomy and how important autonomy is with regards to workplace wellness, having control over how, your domain and how you do your work. And so I started to look at how that was applied outside of work. And essentially that's how I latched on to this idea of fun, which is essentially, a mindfulness tool of being able to enjoy the things that you're in. So being where your feet are, rather than, how we look at happiness here in the West, which is essentially an exercise and evaluation, right? I mean, we've really quantified it to the point where, if it's on a scale of 1 to 10 and you've reached 10, where's the, where do you go with that, right? You can game it kind of like Spinal Tap and say, well, I'm going to turn it up to 11, but it's clear now, through a whole host of research that being overly concerned with happiness is quite problematic, right? Folks that are so introspective and ruminate on that tend to only see the gap between where they are and where they want to be. And once that happens, right, if happiness is out in the horizon, that starts to seep into your identity. Like, oh, okay, well, I'm never quite where I want to be, so I must be unhappy. And it's insidious because it happens very slowly over time. But it's clear that happens to a lot of people. And again, not valuing happiness, right? Wanting people to be happy, wanting people to flourish. But folks that are, again, like I found myself in 2016, where maybe happiness isn't the appropriate response, right? Like maybe you're going through a challenging time, a move, a divorce, like me, processing a loved one's death. And, chasing happiness in that way can actually, be quite problematic to the point now that we're finding it's a pretty direct path to, a clinical outcome. So again,
sorry, can we pause there for a second?
Yeah, please.
Because this is a really interesting, already I knew I was going to love this interview. This is one that doesn't really come up in my interviews, right? It's all, there's so many people that I talk to that are obviously about experts in their field, trying to help people become happy, successful, their best selves, level up, gamify it, whatever you want to call it, right? But there is a very interesting point where if you become obsessed with, this is where I need to be, and it's okay. In a way, that's good, because I always talk about how, and I don't know if you would agree with this, that the secret to happiness is growth, and to always be
absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
right, you've got to constantly be doing this and have a goal that you're working towards, because that's what makes us happy, right? To
North Star is how I refer to it. Yeah.
So, but if then you get just sledgehammered with, some really huge traumatic events in your life, like what happened to you, and it just totally derails progress you might have been making where you thought you were, I mean, that's a whole nother thing that needs to be handled. And there's not a lot of people talking about how to handle that. So this is fascinating to me.
And I would say at a more, a level that probably more people empathize with is that so many of us move the goalposts all the time. So, let's skirt traumatic events for the moment, right? Because that could be, there's going to be a subset that will resonate with that. But for, I think, most of us, especially here in the US, we, in this world of knowledge work, especially if you're an entrepreneur, not really understanding where the goalposts are and not having transition rituals. I know, because I looked at your stuff, like you advocate for this as well. I think too many of us are wearing busy as a badge of honor. The same way in the 90s where we sort of, wore sleep deficits as a badge of honor. And now we know how asinine that is. Even the most staunch advocates of kind of grinding things out, like the Gary V's of the world, have now totally walked that back, right? Like even in VaynerMedia, he has a chief happiness officer because he knows how important enjoying the process is. And so, to highlight what you're saying, we create all of these kind of personal KPIs, some that might not even matter. We've got them through, external influence, instead of really being mindful of, okay, what is it that I can celebrate when I hit it? And how can I enjoy the process so that it's invigorating rather than depleting? And I think that's the most important message. So many of us are still operating through this old Puritan work ethic where, 2 years could go by before we, potentially get to where we want to be. And that whole 2 years was a grind. And because of something in psychology called survivorship bias, right? We champion, the 10% that just killed it, right? And we're like, oh, we want to be like them. And we don't actualize the fact that 9 out of 10 people, have completely burnt out, and they're like, holy shit, that was there we go, right?
Right. I mean, that's right. I mean, this is, I've said this in different ways, but right. I mean, years and years ago, a good example of this is I remember reading this article. I wish I could remember, or I clipped it out. I just remember the gist. And it was in one of these success magazines, like an entrepreneur magazine or something. And I remember it was like the cover was like, whatever year that was, 2014's, most successful, top most successful people and how they got there. So, right. So I'm like reading through it, and the article, the magazine itself didn't actually like put together this correlation that I started to notice as I read each one. But I kind of came up with my own conclusion that, like, I think out of the 10 of them, like at least 50%. I mean, even just in their little, I mean, they each got like 1 or 2 paragraphs, quotes. In that 1 or 2 paragraphs that they had to sum up everything that they've been doing for the last 10, 20, 30 years to have this insane success that they had this past year, they all of these people said that it was about like just being able to push through the hard times, and that there was like so many failures and slaps and just you can't do it, and but they all just said it was just my ability to keep going, and more than that, most of these people commented the fact that people seem to think that I just woke up and was an overnight success, and they laugh because they're like, they don't see the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, and because I kept with it and I persevered and came out on the other side, then people go, oh, he was an overnight success, right?
Well, and there are a few things to unpack there, right? So in the book, I talk about how we've kind of been overprescribed because of Malcolm Gladwell on this idea of 10,000 hours. And so that's a good sort of general benchmark. But also what's in the study that he made popular through, his book is the fact that one of the components of deliberate practice is you shut off once you're done practicing. And so many of us kind of see life through the lens of martyrdom and don't understand that, the folks that you've just mentioned, one, it's going to take probably longer than you think. But two, the folks that are the highest achievers generally do shut down after they really engage in hard practice and take time off the table for themselves, because they know if they don't, they won't have anything left to do the hard work the next day. When I was doing the research for the book, one of the, just kind of light bulb moments was coming across a study out of MIT, Stanford, and Harvard about the hedonic flexibility principle. And what's clear is that people that aren't having fun at all ultimately don't bring any energy the next day to do the harder things. So what this study found was folks that are just kind of filling their lives with busy work ultimately engage in pretty unhealthy forms of escapism, what we call in the literature passive leisure, things like social media, things like drinking, things like, channel surfing. So, again, I don't villainize if you're watching your favorite show, especially if it's with a partner and you guys enjoy that time. You look back 3 weeks from now and you're like, oh yeah, it was amazing because I liked the show and I liked who I was with. But, if you're channel surfing 12 different things, you can't tell me how you spent that time, then
That's
you've got
to,
yeah. So the people that are engaging in what we call active leisure, like, so things that fill you up, right? Maybe it's, taking an amazing course that, again, gets you closer to mastery. Maybe it's whatever it is, connecting with nature, connecting with loved ones. Those are the folks that then have the vigor and vitality to tackle the harder challenges. And that's what we find. Instead of this whole idea that we're pleasure-seeking animals, quite the contrary. When our fun cup is full, then we have the power to go and do the hard stuff. And when it's not, when we don't feel like life's enjoyable at all, you see what you're seeing now, right? Record levels of burnout. The American Psychological Association just came out that 1 out of 4 employees are so burnt out, they don't even know what to do when they get home. Like they, let alone engage in leisure, they just can't do anything, right? And so, you start to look en masse at all these statistics that are happening. Again, another one, the latest social survey that and some of this has to do with the pandemic, of course, but before the pandemic, 39% of Americans said they were very happy. That's now down to 19%. Like, we're doing things wrong. We need to start figuring out how it is that we can start enjoying ourselves. And luckily, that's just an easy course correction, but it does require us to either take control ourselves or be part of the bigger picture and kind of, start to challenge some of the social norms that we're living under.
Amen, brother. Yeah, I call it the broken system, and I think it's extremely difficult to you've got to have like the Goldilocks parents that just happen to have really good values and habits themselves, because we're little parrots and we're mimics, and at an early age, you know, I call them the major influencers in our life, and the first one is your parents, and they're, you know, throughout your formative years, they're a huge part, right? And so it's like, it's kind of a crapshoot. Like, if your parents have bad values, you know, don't focus on the right things, focus on some of these things you're just talking about, are caught up in this, like, if only I could have more, and work and burning out, like, that's what the kid's gonna get, right? And then it's school, right? Don't even get me started on the schooling system. It is getting better. I happen to live in Chicago, where it's probably one of the best in the country in terms of, like, they're starting to teach stuff. I've got a 6, a 3, and a 6-month-old, so I'm seeing it very early on. I'm watching very closely what they're teaching these kids, and he is in public school, and they're starting to teach stuff like emotional intelligence and learning, and you know, these life skills. But I mean, I remember going through school, I'm sure it's same for you, like, they didn't teach any goals, how to balance your checkbook, like any of this stuff from the relationships, career, you know, it was all about, like, just learn this stuff. And a lot of times, you know, math, advanced algebra, trigonometry, like, why are we learning all these? And yes, the basics of it is good, math, history, English, but when we're, like, going so far to learn all these things, but we're not learning, like, the basic skills of how to be happy and to kind of survive and get through life and learn some of these things that you're talking about, to me, it's just ludicrous, right? And then you've got your peers, they're just mimics of their parents, right? And
you
tend to want to do
touch on something too, I think, as a more macro influence, is that, you know, we do live in a meritocracy, and to some degree, because you and I both are believer in game mechanics, that's good, right? But ultimately, the allure of that reward, you know, not to channel Alan Watts too much, right? But it's so off in the distance that we're just achieving, and not really happily achieving, right? It's like, okay, well, if I get good grades, then I can get into college. And if I get into a good undergraduate program, then I can get into a good graduate program. Okay, now I have a good job as, you know, an investment banker. And in 20 years, then I'll finally, you know, have, you know, the ability to enjoy the wealth that I've accumulated. And you look at these folks over time, and they're not happy people, right? And so I like Simon Sinek a lot. I think the whole idea of know your why has now been overprescribed. I think we need to pull back a little bit and wonder, what is your what? What are you giving up, you know, for the things that you want? How, you know, and so, you know, again, it goes back to those goalposts. Like, if you know what you're trying to achieve, then you can celebrate those milestones. And that's where I see really successful people, right? Like, I've done what I want to do, and you can always figure out, like, where are the elements of the playground where I can potentially have stretch goals and things of that nature. But if it's endless, right? If you can't be satiated, we know that's pretty much a direct path to pretty unhappy times.
That's right. And at the beginning of this, I don't know if you caught it. I was talking about the Yale Happiness course. Have you taken it? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I'm definitely familiar. And the book's amazing. So I actually see on Amazon that people that buy my book are buying his as well. So
yeah. Wait, his? I thought it was, so the one I saw was an online course. It was a female.
Oh, you're talking about Laura Santos. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the book that the 25 that followed the folks for quite a longitudinal time.
Got it.
The Good Life. Sorry.
The Good Life. Yeah. I've not read that one yet.
No, Laura's course is really good as well. And I did take that over the pandemic. Apologies, right. I got mixed up there.
You did. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, you know, and that's, I love that course because, and that's why I was excited to have you on, because, and you've already dropped some studies, which I love. To me, I think people more than ever now, I think our society is becoming a lot less trusting than it used to be as time goes on, and everybody's an expert and people are spouting, and you don't know what to listen to, who to listen to. You don't know what's valuable, what's not, right? And it's like, to me, at the end of the day, science is science. And if studies have been done, like, that's where you need to go. And that's what you need to look. And a lot of the studies, you know, that's just study after study after study in that course, as you know. And
I think the biggest takeaway for me, I'm sure everyone's going to take away different elements, but Dr. Santos brings up Dr. Cassie Holmes' work out of UCLA. And I believe she showed some other studies, but she was highlighting Dr. Holmes the most, with what we call in science time poverty. And so it is clear that people that understand that time is a finite resource and that essentially you can make more money whenever you want, even though, granted, that assertion is from a place of privilege. Some people, that are lower on Maslow's triangle, if you can't feed your family, I get it. Trying to go find fun might not necessarily be, the right thing for you in this moment. But for the folks that do feel like they generally have their safety needs met, valuing time and understanding that you have control over your time certainly seems to be one of the most advantageous pathways to sustainable happiness. I don't know if you remember that from the course.
I do. And I mean, couldn't agree more. And, it's funny. This is when things pop into your head or when you hear something, and I read it in a book one time where it was like, the things you want to like write down or really like pay attention to are when you've heard something multiple times and it kind of keeps rearing its head. And this is one that keeps rearing its head just recently even. And there's a movie, and it reminded me of this when I heard it recently, where somebody's saying a very similar thing about how time is really the only currency. When you really just take a 10,000 foot view and you strip everything down, it's like time. It's all about that. And there's that movie Out of Time, I think it was called.
I'm not familiar. Is it good?
With the dancer guy. What's his name? Justin Timberlake. Really good. Really good movie, actually. He's a pretty darn good actor. Underrated in my opinion. But it's set in the future where time is your currency, and you have this watch, and it's basically like tells you how much time you have left.
Oh my goodness!
And you work, and they put more time on, and when it expires, you die. Basically, like if it gets to zero, right? So there's like people that are living like day to day. They've got 24 hours, and they have to keep working in order. I mean, it's so interesting, and it just ties into this what we're talking about here, which is time really is the ultimate and the only currency. And it's like, how are you using your time, and how are you going to look back? And that's one of the exercises that I do with people. I call it the Back to the Future exercise. I used to call it the funeral exercise, but that's way too morbid, I think.
That's
so Back to the Future. Go ahead.
Because I have something similar. I latched onto my own story and Rick Ellis's, the gentleman that survived the miracle on the Hudson. And it's clear, right, when you have an intimate relationship with time, that things are better. We've already said that. And I'll make this interjection quick, but I might take your advice, because right now in the book I offer a death clock, and so maybe we'll need a rebrand.
Oh, I like it. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, no, you should watch this movie, because I mean, right. I mean, it all centers on all this stuff we're talking about. And yeah, it is interesting, but yeah, shoot. Now I've lost it. Where was
we were talking about time, and you were talking about your exercise.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, there's different ways. I call it Back to the Future because to me, I'm an 80s geek, and it's like my favorite movie from the 80s. And it's a more fun way to say basically like what we're talking about right now. One of the best ways to figure out what it is that is truly important to you, because we're all different. We all have unique DNA. We all have different personalities, likes, dislikes, strengths, weaknesses, passions, right? So you can't just take blanket advice. You need to figure out what it is at your core that matters most. And I have these 5 cores: relationships, mindset, physical health, emotional health, and I'm missing one. Mindset, career and finance, relationships, physical health, emotional health. But anyways, but you've got to figure out within each core, those are universal. We all have those. But within each, where do you want to end up at the end of the day? Like at your funeral, your eulogy is being given. What do you want said? Right. And then you I like to call it's kind of back to the future, right? You're actually coming back to the present, and you're going, okay, I'm here now. Holy cow. How lucky am I to have a chance to actually become that person, right? So you're kind of reverse engineering it and deciding what are the habits that I want to build and how do I want to build them?
Yeah, it goes back to that reframe of, again, most of us now know our why because it's been so overprescribed to us, but what, you're essentially asking the what, right? And I think that's a great macro exercise, one I also advocate, but then also even at the micro level, like, this year, if you don't spend any time with your family, so that's the what you're giving away. What is it worth? And are you getting a fair, exchange of value, especially if you're working for someone else? And I think to your point, Gen Xers and the generation before me, we were brought up with parents where there was a pretty honest value exchange. My parents got a pension. I don't need to worry about them anymore. And so they value that, relationship with their employer because they are now taken care of, right? They have health insurance, and we just don't have the accessibility unless you get a job, in public service to those types of things. So we need to think about the way we spend our time in different ways. And so there are a lot of different headwinds. I mean, that's just one. Again, it's not one that needs to be overemphasized, but I think the world is just different, right? And then like another one is the U-shaped curve of happiness, right? Fortunately, we're all living longer. That also means we're having kids later, and our parents are living longer. So we have obligations that previous generations couldn't even fathom, right? Because, oftentimes now we're not just taking care of our immediate family, but we have, responsibilities that are unique to our era.
That's another really good one that people don't normally talk about, but that is so true. I was just literally ran into a friend the other day and hadn't seen him in a while, and I asked, how are you? Typical, how's it going? And he said good, but I knew it was a very muted good. And I was like, everything all right? And he basically shared with me that within 1 month, his brother, who's only in his mid-40s, got diagnosed with cancer, as did his mom, who's like in her early 90s. And, so not only does he have to, but the mom part, like, is what you're just talking about, which, and my parents, I'm going through it right now. It's like they're living longer, and all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, like I've got all this stuff going on in my life. I got 3 kids. I got a zillion things that I'm trying to do. Now all of a sudden I've got to figure out how to take care of these people. And there's no real roadmap for that, because this is kind of really the first generation, that this is happening. I mean, my grandmother, maybe call it second. Because my grandmother lived to be about 100, and but fortunately they were very wealthy, and they put her in a very nice assisted living facility for the last 7 years of her life or so, and she was happy, and it was in LA, and my relatives were there, and they visited her and stuff. But for people that don't have that, the money and the resources, I mean, I know people whose parents are living with them. I mean, it's for real. So what is your recommendation for this? How do you get through this stuff?
Thanks for that. I think what's important is, especially folks that are in that situation, right? We call it the sandwich generation. They're coming from a good place, right? A place of service and a place of duty. And what I would suggest to them, and again, the science is all in the book, is that if you're not enjoying some of the things that you're doing, you're not going to be able to have the capacity to take care of others. And so making sure that, again, you're creating some space for renewal, whether that is, leisure through low arousal activities like calm, or things that you enjoy, because for others, and I would say a majority of folks, feeling like they are living some of the life for themselves, even if that doesn't feel right, becomes an important component to live a life of service for others. And it's clear from, sort of the domestic duties that we've already talked to, big impactful change makers. Like, at the end of the book, I look at a whole host of folks that have made a big impact. And then also, again, going back to survivorship bias, the ones that have kind of run themselves down to a nub. And so if you want any sort of longevity to do good work, like if that is your vibe, and you kind of do want to make an impact, again, whether that's through your immediate sort of social bonds of your family, to doing huge, global charity events. I can't spit out philanthropy right now. You need the ability to recharge your batteries, or you won't be useful. And so again, even if you kind of think that fun is whimsical, or you've undervalued it, and there's evolutionary underpinnings for why that has happened. And I unpack that in the book. You need that in your life, because if we're not living a joyful life, then, it just becomes harder to continue on, no matter what we're doing.
I mean, yeah. So let's really get into it now. I mean, we've been dancing around it, but obviously the fun aspect is really the heart of what you're talking about and what I talk about. Can you kind of give me your 10,000 foot view? I mean, I know you've already touched on it in some of these questions, but kind of just the heart of what it is that you're doing, what you've noticed, and how you're using it to help people change their lives and their habits.
Yeah, I think in the context of what your audience would be interested in, it's clear that for any habit to have any sort of longevity, you need to enjoy certain components of it, right? And so you can boil that down to, for folks that are familiar with System 1 and System 2 thinking, when there's a cognitive load or sort of discomfort, or we have to use willpower, in the literature we call it ego depletion, to be able to continue on, then that kind of burns up fuel, right? I mean, we have a certain capacity to do that type of hard work. And so if there isn't any component that's enjoyable, then, over time, for some, that have a ton of willpower, it might be 8 months, right? But for a majority of us, like we see it in fitness, right? 4 out of 5 people generally quit, after 8 to 10 weeks. If they're not enjoying themselves, if we're not enjoying what we're doing, we're not going to have any sort of continuity or longevity to the habits that we're trying to create. So the folks that are getting it right, and so again, to use an example from, the world that I used to live in, that's why you see really engaging Group X classes, ones with music that people enjoy and instructors that, have a level of charisma that brings people in. You'll see people go to those classes for years. And that's because at the end of the day, they enjoy doing that activity, not because they care about exercise. And so when we can get over the hump, because a lot of us, again, and it's somewhat due to social norms, like we want to be martyrs, right? Like we want to grind it out, know? But, so that's interesting in context, but it's not sustainable. And so why not have both, Again, if you had this level of mastery, and we know this is where flow lives, right? So you could also get that extra benefit of flow, like get right up to that edge of like, okay, this is kind of hard, but also that edge of I'm kind of enjoying myself. Because once you do, then time kind of evaporates, right? You're just really enjoying the activities that you're engaging in rather than going, I'll get through this, and again, which is not sustainable.
So let's unpack this. This is so good. Right. So first buzzword here is the willpower. I want to kind of just focus on that for a second, because that is such a huge part of this. And I want to make sure people listening to what you just said understand the role. Here's a good example. This just, okay, a week ago, I went and had coffee and donuts with my buddy and his wife. Their kids are the same age as ours. And he starts telling me, we start talking, and first of all, I noticed that he was drinking black coffee. I put cream in my coffee, and I said, black coffee, huh? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, how did that come about? And he's like, well, I had a trainer years ago when I was trying to get in really good shape, and he asked me, how many cups of coffee do you drink? And he said, well, like 3 or 4. And he's like, and you're putting cream in each? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, do you know how many calories that is? He's like, I never really thought about it. And they started doing the math, and he's like, whoa, that's a lot. And so rather than this is where there's I kind of combine fun with, so what you're using the word fun, and I use that as well, but I also use sort of reducing the friction, kind of like, I'm sure you're familiar with James Clear, making it easy, obvious, rewarding, to be able to take an action. And one of those things is to make it super small and tiny, like BJ Fogg would say, right? And so what he started doing, instead his trainer smartly, instead of saying just cut the cream out, right, which would require willpower, which will always run out, because as you said, it's a finite resource, and you only have so much to where your body goes, oh, like, I'm out of gas. Like, no, I need my cream, right? But in this case, he said, just take a teeny tiny little bit out, each time you pour. And he did. And he started going down very, very small amounts. And he said after, it took about a month or so, but he got to the point where he only had a teeny bit of cream in there. He's like, do I really need this cream? And he took it out, boom. Now he's drinking black coffee for life. Habit set, autopilot, doesn't even have to think about it, right? And I'm like, oh, that's a really good one, right? And then he pivots to telling me how he's about to go on this Weight Watchers diet. He says it's his third time doing it. He lost 30 to 40 pounds both other times, and without even blinking. And, you know, this is fairly a new friend, so I probably should have been a little bit more less direct, but I just, who I am and what I know, I basically said, it ain't gonna work. I was like, we're gonna be having the same conversation in a year. And he's like, okay, why? And I said, because I was like, and he started telling me about the Weight Watchers. And they've started using some gamification and fun stuff like points and rewards. But in general, it's still, the heart of it is willpower.
And
right?
you know what's
it's
amazing? So
calories. Go ahead.
My dad's the head, he retired a couple years ago. He's still lecturing, but he was the chairman of nutrition at UC Davis. And so we're just talking about this literally, just to back you up with some stats. So Weight Watchers still to this day is the most successful weight loss program available. The recidivism rate is 90%. So 9 out of 10 people of the most successful weight loss program available is 1 out of 10. So that just shows you know, so I, love BJ and James too, and I agree with everything they say because that's exactly right, reduce the friction. My add to that, and I got some of this, because he helped me refine my ideas, just to give a hat tip to the professor, Dr. Hamilton out of Emory University. Of all people, he studied Terry Crews, right, the comedian. I'm not sure if you're that big yoked guy that I think he got famous for a deodorant commercial, but he's done tons of movies. I think he was in White Girls, right? So here's a guy that loves exercise, right? But he said the secret to it, and I think I've seen this across the board, so I'm going to use him as an example, but I think you could apply it to anything, is that if there's a task where you're not really that good at it, again, we'll use exercise as an example since we have throughout the podcast, he says, make it enjoyable. So for him, he just started going to the gym. He didn't even work out. He just went to one where he really enjoyed the space, kind of enjoyed the people that was around him, but he didn't start working out yet, right? Then slowly but surely, he started to add components, but at a level that made sense. And so making things enjoyable so you want to go back to them, and then playing with the hard part, slowly but surely integrating it so that it becomes comfortable, I think is an extremely effective way and an important add to what you've already shared from other behavioral scientists, that why not make this habituated activity something that you're like, you know what, at the end of the day, even if this part's hard, I really just enjoy the people that are there or the environment, that's in there. Or again, the activity, again, with fitness, if you hate the gym, how many other ways are there to get fit? Like, if that's not enjoyable for you, go find, your vibe in nature.
Yeah, no, I got all that. Totally, right? And yes, I mean, so did you say, by the way, his name, is it Terry Crews? Is that who it was you were saying? Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
That, I love finding examples of people in the world that use this stuff. So I'm taking notes as we talk, because I'm gonna.
I'll give you his quotes. His quotes are, because this is like verbatim from him, so it's not even just conjecture, right? He's literally talked about developing habits through fun. And again, here's a guy who's yoked, right? I mean, clearly he, fitness is something that he also enjoys, but even a guy like him still needs to make the habit fun for it to stick. Yeah.
And you have a quote?
Yeah, I'll provide it to you.
Oh, got it.
I don't know. I don't have it memorized.
Like, what is it? Yeah.
I'll put it in a comment.
Yeah, put it in the comments. I love that. Right. And so at the end of the day, right, it's like you gotta figure out a way. Again, like, so for whatever what fun is to him may not be fun to you. Right. And
Absolutely.
so what drives me nuts is, all these people going on. And when you see somebody giving a piece of just generic advice, like, I don't know, it drives me. I'm to the point where I almost get angry because I'm like, how is that going to help this person? That person's going to get a little dopamine hit and be like, yeah, I should totally get in shape this year. And yes, I should go to the gym. But it's like, okay, how? Like, you're talking about going from A to Z. How do you go from A to B first, and then B to
Absolutely.
C, and then C to D? You got to connect the dots, and you got to reduce that friction. You got to make it fun. You got to make it rewarding, easy, simple, obvious.
You
These
bring
types
up
of
an important, sorry to interject. I was
Yep.
just that if it doesn't work, play with the variables, right? Like I talk about that with regards to gratitude journaling. Like gratitude is clearly an amazing tool, right? Like for very few people is it not going to be successful. But someone, similar to drinking 8 glasses of water a day, and how Freakonomics kind of, did a pretty good job of showing that advice kind of went off the rails. I mean, Sonia Lubomirsky out of UC Riverside showed how somehow people latched on to finding 3 things a day to be grateful for, and how if you overprescribe, especially someone, like in my situation, 2016, where I didn't necessarily want to be grateful for anything. I wanted to unpack something that was fairly traumatic, that when the motivation doesn't hit, it creates this dissonance that is not only harmful, but potentially can just, send us off in weird directions where we totally lose motivation, right? And so figuring out what works for you, because I thought your example was spot on. Like maybe there's 60% of that wisdom that you take, and then throw out the other 40 instead of feeling bad about it. Like, well, that sucks. This didn't work for me. So obviously I'm broken in some fashion. And it's important because that's the crux, the toxic positivity, right? Like that's where things have gone so wrong, especially over the last 5 years, similar to sort of what hustle porn did, before the pandemic. Like you just get steered too far the wrong way, and you think like, oh, well, this is what they prescribed and it must be absolute and immutable. Like when you can take, just a piece of it and, really make it valuable for you by incorporating it in with your own personal system, what works, with your DNA.
That's right. And a big part of that, I think that just going back to the 10,000 foot view of our broken system, and just kind of how I think that it's becoming harder and harder for us to even know who we are, right? Like back in the day, things were a lot simpler, right? When it was like, okay, I live on a farm and there's like 4 people I can talk to that are around me, and I go out, and if I want milk, I go out and I go to the cow and I milk the, now you've got like 8 different devices going at once. You're constantly being bombarded for our attention. And these, like we alluded to earlier, companies like, Facebook it's just called social media companies, Google, they're monetizing our attention. Like they're a for-profit. These things that we're going down the rabbit hole, we're spending all this time. To your point earlier about how we're becoming less and less happy, the World Happiness Report I think we've gone down every single year, right? Depression is becoming a global pandemic, and teen suicide, all-time high. That's not an accident, right? And it's like just we knowing what to pay attention to, knowing ourselves, understanding the world around us. So that's like the first most important step, like awareness. And how many people do you know? And again, this goes back to our schooling system too. Like, you don't teach you don't make a list of your strengths, of your passions, right? You don't figure out a way to cultivate that and say, okay, right? It's just kind of like a lot of kids and a lot of people, you're right now, even though it's getting better, the schooling system is you go through, you take your tests, and it's like, oh, you fit into this box and you do well on tests. You're smart. Oh, you don't do well on tests. You're not very smart, right? And then they start to get their identity. But what about that they're like, they might be a genius with something completely unrelated to the tests that they're taking, and that doesn't come out. It's really sad to think about. And it's like to really everything we're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like kind of centers around just everybody figuring out, like making it their number one priority to figure out who they are at the core, what makes them happy, what's truly going to make them happy in the end, so they can start kind of, again, back to the future, reverse engineering it and figuring out the habits that they need to develop to get there. But not just that, personalizing those habits to their personality DNA. Like you were saying, I liked how you put it. I wrote down, if it doesn't work, play with the variables, right? So it's like, don't just try a blanket thing that you heard, like going to the gym or something. Like, what works for you? For me, I love playing basketball. I can play basketball for 2 hours because of the competition, because I get to hang out with my guy friends before and after, all sorts of reasons. I'm drenched in sweat. I played last night, and I do it when the kids go to bed, and it doesn't even feel like exercise, right? But for somebody else that doesn't play basketball, like, that'd be ludicrous. So you got to figure out what that is for you, right?
No, you're spot on. The one thing I would, add my take on too is what I've come to understand is, yes, we should value wanting to be happy, but having that as any sort of outcome or goal, it's problematic, right? So being mindful of how you are engaging in your activities and just extrapolating out, what I would call joy and delight. And again, these are just constructs, right? The way we use English but we've essentially quantified happiness now. And we know that now that we've done that, because there's essentially a peak that you can't go above, that as soon as we try and sort of unpack that, it leads to unhappy times. So what I would suggest is that, yes, everything that you said is correct. Figure out what lights you up, and then just joyfully be where your feet are and engage in those activities in a playful way, instead of doing it, through a lens of martyrdom or a sense of duty that is completely, depleting of your energy. Because when we enjoy life, that there's an abundance of that type of energy. I mean, we want to continue on for all the reasons that we discussed, over the last hour.
That's right. And so let's go back to the other thing earlier when I was saying there's two things I want to unpack. Willpower was the first. The second one that I really wanted to kind of pause on and have a discussion about is some of these companies that are starting to get it. You talk about Terry Crews and some of these, Mark Wahlberg's another one. When I look at his routine and how he does it, like, he does it in a fun way. There's a lot of different examples where it's not like, but granted, there are some people that seem to be able to get away with it, at least for a while, of kind of doing it the hard way and the martyrdom way of like, I get up, I hate it, right? But I think at a certain point that's your willpower that is gonna run out. But when
you might be one of the 10 that enjoys that. So I certainly don't want to villainize people. I mean, I think CrossFit is a good example, although I did do research in CrossFit as a graduate student, and you see a lot of people, essentially graduate out of CrossFit because it's so hard, right? That I don't know. Mm-hmm. But the people that are in it, man, they love it, right? They love the fact that they're, that they found their tribe. So I think anyway, sorry to digress, but I think
no, that's an interesting point because, right, I would say, well, let's talk about this. We'll get back to what I was just talking about, which I want to start talking about a few companies and give some examples. Like before I forget, let's make this point and then finish this and then go back.
Sure.
The bottom line is, right, like you mentioned, like companies like where it's fun and stuff. And I remember Orange Theory came out years ago. My wife started doing it and she came back. She's like, oh my God. She's like, there's this class I just went to. And she's like, they had these screens and it showed you where you were compared to the rest of the class. So there was competition, there was social connectivity, there was technology, the instructor was fun. And it was like, she's like, and it was like right up her alley. And that, to me, that's like gamifying. It's making it fun, right? They made it fun. And they were the first ones. And then, remember Peloton came along during the pandemic, perfect example. You're stuck at home. You can't do that. But now you have this thing where you can have an instructor right in front of you and he's fun. And the most popular one.
I'm a big fan. That's where I find my fun. I write about it in the book.
Yeah. And she follows this guy on Instagram and, it's like become a whole thing, right? Where it's like versus just going for a bike ride to go for a bike ride if you don't want to, right? But, so anyways, I think that's a huge component. It's neat to see certain companies starting to get it. And I like to point them out because it's like, duh, they're crushing it for a reason because they get it. They're making the hard stuff fun. They're figuring out how to way to connect your brain to going, oh, this is cool. I'm enjoying myself. And like you said, when you have that, like then it's unboundless energy and you can do it way longer and for a much more sustained period of time.
And similar to how I championed Gary Vee kind of walking back, him telling people to stop watching television and crush it after you put your kids to sleep because he realizes that's not sustainable. You see Peloton doing the same thing, so I give them credit. Granted, they had hyper growth, so they're going through some interesting challenges from a corporate level, but they've done a couple things, right? What I find really interesting is they make exercise episodic. So some of their most engaged classes are like 15 and 20 minutes because that's something health clubs aren't very good at doing, right? We kind of have this unit of time of an hour. And so, for folks that might be just getting started, taking an hour HIIT class, like, again, going back to James Clear's wisdom, right? That's a lot of friction, right? So, I've never exercised before. And, even my beginner class is an hour's worth of high intensity interval training. So Peloton, is onto something with regards to what is the minimal viable dose so that I can build up that level of mastery. And then you've seen them walk back their own hustle culture. I mean, all these folks were A-type, right? So, they all were like, blood, sweat, and tears, right? Like most trainers, but they're also super wise. So you don't hear any of them say that anymore. All of them, Robin, all the best instructors are like, hey, you're here and I'm going to give you motivation if it hits, but also know this is your time. They realize the importance of autonomy because they want to make it fun. And so they're a great example.
Totally. Yeah. I love that. No, that's a really good example. And yeah, and then going back to the other thing that we were starting to talk about, which is, the pain, the CrossFit and certain people. I want to kind of unpack that really quick. So I guess I in my brain, I'm still a little confused. So at first you started to say, well, that is that 1 out of 10 that if that's your thing. And then you said, well, then I did research and people actually do graduate out of that. But then you went back and you were saying, but if that's your thing. So I'm confused about this. Like, I guess something like CrossFit. So I guess I would see it as, yes, I remember when that was a huge thing. I don't know if it still is, but I remember like a bunch of my friends they were all in, and you could see it in their eyes when they would talk about it. It wasn't like, oh, I have to go to CrossFit. It was like CrossFit. It was like this like cult. But then you're right. I feel like I didn't hear people talking about it anymore. And is there something there where it's like, if something's fun, but it's not sustainable, or it becomes, if it's fun, but then it's like, it's too hard, your body goes and your brain goes, no, let's move on to something with less friction. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to two things. One, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, but I talk about it in the book, right? If you start making weird choices, I talk about it as a mental frame, like ask yourself honestly, are you running towards something or are you running away from something, right? So like, again, I saw it in the comments, people are rightfully like bringing up, also eating disorders and things of that nature at epidemic levels. I think we're creating this level of motivation that's not sustainable or even reasonable for that matter. So, kind of skirting the CrossFit question per se, like, I think you need to check yourself, right? Like, has this become a habituated activity of escapism, or is it meant for betterment? And I think, to answer your question specifically, what's tough about CrossFit is it's clear that for some people they like that hard work, but there are a lot of people that injure themselves because I think one of the problematic things, and maybe CrossFit has fixed this because I looked at it, back in 2016, is there was no assessment. So again, it kind of goes back to the example of throwing an unexperienced athlete into a 1 hour HIIT class. You were seeing some of that phenomena at CrossFit where, people want to do immediately sort of normalize to the social condition in there, and they were doing things that were far outside their level of excellence, right? And so they were getting injured to the point that they couldn't exercise. Again, I'm not going to quantify what I found because it was a qualitative study, but there were people that loved CrossFit that essentially worked themselves to a point where they weren't even, CrossFit or not, they weren't going to be able to exercise in the way that they used to. So I found that quite problematic in that particular study, right? And it's a good metaphor for anything. And again, it goes back to, okay, know your why, but also know your what. What are you willing to give away? I think, I'll use myself as an example. I was an Ironman athlete at 220 pounds. I think if I could go back and talk to that guy, because I am that elk, I like want to suffer. That's to some degree, I find, that a component of fun, and probably why I wrote the book, because I needed it myself. But that's why I got a hip replacement, probably because I pounded the hell out of my body, doing extreme exercise in a way that wasn't necessarily for my own betterment, but really just for fulfillment of doing something hard. I don't think I would talk to that guy, but I wouldn't change it, because that is what I find fun. Those things that kind of lead to transcendence and peak experience.
So, I mean, I think as you're saying this, all right, I feel like I've even got a better take on it, which is, I feel like at the end of the day, it goes back to how we started this interview. Like, that secret to happiness is the ABG, to always be growing. And I think a challenge fits right into that. And so it's certain people maybe have an affinity for, I mean, call it competitive. There's different words, but I would consider myself one of these people as well, like you, right? Like, oh, you better believe I like to push myself, and I want to push myself as far. And so I actually, playing basketball, I tore my my ACL and my meniscus, which is a really bad one.
Yeah.
I had major surgery, and I was out for about 10 months, and I couldn't play basketball, and it was miserable. And I was just dying to get back on the court. And my doctor was like, dude, no, like, you need to do the rehab. And I'm going to rehab. And I'm like, when can I get back? When can I back? Right. And I think it's that, just, even though it's not good for you, like, that's where your fun is coming from. And that you're pushing yourself, and that's filling that, whatever that is, that the what, the why, whatever we want to call it. And so you're like, I got to do it. It's like not even a question, right?
Yeah.
My grandmother had 2 hip operations. My mother's now had 2 hip operations, right? So, knock on wood, but we're a very active family. So I get it now. I think, but like you said, I think at a certain point, your body just goes, we can't do this anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe CrossFit, people age out of it.
And again, I think it's just knowing what you are, and again, have you gotten to a state, in more general terms, that would probably be more helpful for the people listening? Like, are you making weird choices that aren't necessarily things that are leading to your own betterment, so that you can sustain, this mild addiction for what you're doing? Or is it something, that you really enjoy and that's leading to your betterment? The last thing I would add to, always be growing, which I could definitely buy into, is I think a key component of fun is things that lead to us feeling like we're more in a we environment than a me environment. So anything that connects us either to the things that we really enjoy, which we've just talked about at length, to the people that we really love, or to the places that we really care about, like, nature and things of that nature, or home, or whatever that means to you.
Right. That's right. That's the part of the gamification stuff when I'm talking about, like, ways to sort of have more fun, trick your brain into wanting to do. Social connectivity is a huge thing. I mean, that goes back to our primal, back thousands and thousands of years ago, where you had a better chance of surviving if you were in a group than if you're out on your own, where the saber-tooth tiger could just get you. Right, and that's in our DNA, I think, to have that connection, to thrive with others. We can build more, we can grow more. That's an evolutionary thing, and so you can't ignore that. And it is, I think, just like I was saying with the Orange Theory, where my wife went, all of a sudden, you're in this group, and competition is another one, gamification element, where it's like, right, it's social connectivity, competing against others. It just makes it more interesting, more fun, just having people there. And, as it's like an accountability partner. I mean, there's so many benefits to it. So I'm totally with you. Like, if you can figure out a way to do it with others, it's just a lot easier. I mean, just going to the gym. I used to do it. Going to the gym by yourself to lift weights, no music, no podcast, right? I don't know how I used to do it. I did.
I know. Same.
But I look back, I'm like, wow, that was just pure willpower. And sure enough, I stopped doing it, right? It didn't become a lifelong habit. But I was able to, I used some gamification elements. Like I would listen to podcasts of people that I liked, and I would actually, that helped me, because then it was like I was kind of working out with somebody, but somebody that had really good things to say, and I would just like literally pause my workout, I would do my reps, and if something was interesting that was said, I would kind of just stop what I was doing, and I would pull out my phone, and I'm a crazy note taker. I've got like bazillions of pages of notes, and like when I would hear something that was like, yes, I would like write it down, right? So I'd come out of my workout feeling really good, because it was like, not only did I get a good workout, but now I've like also got these little pieces of wisdom that I'm going to add into my system.
Absolutely.
James
clears habit bundling at its best.
So speaking of habit bundling, right? I was reading about temptation bundling. You talked about that. So let's we'll wrap up the next 5-10 minutes here, but let's talk about a few things. Let's talk about temptation bundling, and then the other thing I had a note to come back to was flow. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that because you mentioned that a few times. So let's start with the temptation bundling, or whichever you want.
Yeah. So with temptation bundling, this is a old concept from behavioral science, but it's been brought up. I think Katie Milkman and James have made it quite popular. And it's essentially what we know is that if there's a harder thing that we need to get done, we can use a pleasurable experience to increase the motivation for getting that done. So that can either be, a reward afterwards, or it can be, what I call activity bundling, where you essentially add a pleasurable component, but you make that contingent on doing the thing. So again, you can certainly, hey, if I get, my dissertation done, I'll reward myself with getting to go to an NFL game or whatever it is, right? That's meaningful for me, but whatever's meaningful for you. But another way to do it in real time, so you're actually making the activity, I call these agonizing activities in the book, but just anything that you don't necessarily feel motivated to do, you can add a component that you only get to do if you're doing that thing. So for instance, if you really hate exercise, but you really enjoy, listening to a podcast, you only allow yourself to listen to that podcast if you're doing that activity. And so for me, the way I use that effectively is that I have 2 kids and I love 90s hip hop. And obviously, with all the explicit language within that music, the only real opportunity to listen to it is with headphones. So I allow myself only to listen to it while I'm cleaning the house, because I'll put headphones on and they don't want to clean the house, so they leave me alone. And that's me time, right? And my wife loves it too, because I'm contributing, and so I'm totally left alone. I'm listening to music that brings me back to all of these joyful memories from Chico State and Davis High School, and I'm always smiling doing something I actually really dislike doing. So that's the crux of that strategy.
Ooh, I love it. I love that. I'm so glad I asked that question. Right, temptation bundling. I like your twist. Did you come up with activity bundling? Is that something that because it is I like that twist, because, right, so temptation bundling, just to be clear to people watching, is if I do this, then I'll get this. If I do this thing that I need to do, then I'll get this thing that I want, right? And so it's more of like the way I look at it and I use it is, shoot, okay, it's almost lunchtime. I'm getting really hungry, but I'm not going to allow myself to go eat until I finish this project that I'm working on, right? Whether it's going to take 2 minutes, but and in a way, that's the best thing to do, because that ties into the Pareto. Is it Pareto or Parkinson's? I always get those two confused. I think Parkinson's, where you basically, the amount of time you give yourself to do something, you're able to basically figure out a way to do it in that amount of time. That's not exactly the definition, but the gist is, give yourself less time to do something, and you'll make it happen, right? So it's like, if I had given myself another 45 minutes to complete that task, it would have easily taken me 45 minutes. But if I'm like, I'm really hungry, but I'm not going to eat until I finish this, all of a sudden my brain becomes like Superman, and I become super focused, and I cut out all the bullshit, and it's like, okay, I'm going to do exactly what needs to be done, and no more, no less. It doesn't have to be perfect. And it's a way to be super productive, right? So that's an example for me of temptation bundling. Whereas what you're saying is, well, just add that thing right in with the activity to begin with. So in my example, it might be, okay, if I love listening to 90s hip hop, I can only do it when I'm working in my office on a project I know I need to get done, right? Is that basically the gist of it?
Yeah. And it's essentially an extension of temptation bundling. Activity bundling is really, a more broad methodology for finding opportunities to enjoy yourself in otherwise sort of mundane situations. But that is a facet, just so that I'm not, claiming ownership of that idea. It is essentially just decreasing the amount of time, between the two activities. And so it very much is essentially just another facet of temptation bundling. Like you see, and it doesn't have to just be, something that you're listening to. I've seen folks successfully do that with books, right? So like my wife loves historical nonfiction. And so only allowing her access to a favorite book if she's on an exercise bicycle would be an example that doesn't necessarily, mean putting headphones on. So there are creative ways to do this in all sorts of facets. Just figure out what is that thing you really like doing, and then use it as a motivational tool to get the harder stuff done. I like the little, in the book I say, use having fun to get the hard work done.
Ooh, I like that. I'm gonna take that note. Use having fun to get the hard work done. So speaking of, right, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, we got to wrap this up pretty soon, but this kind of ties into habit stacking, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Habit stacking is a little bit different. Habit stacking is, okay, you've already got, the way I look at it is you've already got the momentum that you're doing a habit, right? Habits, remember, they don't care if they're good or bad, helping or hurting us. Once they're on autopilot, they're on autopilot for the most part. And your brain's like, okay, got it. Your neurons, like, they learn to fire together, and you don't have to think about it, right? So habit stacking, like, you're already doing a habit. So for instance, you're going down to have your morning coffee. That's a habit that you have. Okay, what can you add to that you want to actually be something that you need in your life, that you want to do, right? So for me, it became, my coffee becomes, then I sit on the couch with my kids and we fill each other's love tanks. We talk, we play, we chat, and then once they're off to school, then I prioritize my emails, or I go through my emails, I get rid of the ones that, I don't want to sit in front of my desk and waste my time with my most creative time. And then I prioritize today, like, this is what the most important thing is that I need to get done today, right? And so that's like become like my little ritual, habit stacking, whereas it used to just be I'd sit on the couch, back in the day and watch, turn on the news and get depressed at politics or whatever is going on, or the stock market going down, right? So that habit stacking, which kind of ties in, would you have a different way to say that, or to tie habit stacking into activity bundling?
Yeah, I think it can be an effective tool for making something more enjoyable, and it goes back to the Terry Crews example. So I don't want to overstate, but I think, the idea there is that we know through the psychological concept called heuristics that, we build these algorithms, right? So that we can take things out of system two, the system two arena, and essentially reduce the cognitive load of doing habituated behavior. And so the only thing I would have to add to that is that if that routine is pleasurable, it's going to be more sustaining than something where you could, potentially break the habit stack, because at some point, just like Jenga, right? It gets too squirrely, and you're like, I don't enjoy doing any of this, and right. It's gonna, that algorithm's gonna break.
I like that. Right. So you need to be careful with your habit stack, that you don't add too many things that you've got some resistance to. Or I guess another way to look at it is just make sure what you're habit stacking with, you enjoy in some way, right? You're, again, like we've been talking about this whole show, like personalizing it to you, so that it's, like somebody might look at having to hang out with their kids as a chore, right? But for me, I love it. We're playing, we're having fun. I every morning I take the moment to go, they are never going to be this age again. Like, I've gotten in that habit. That's a habit that I've developed, and it's one of these, gratefulness is obviously a huge habit, and reminding yourself how lucky you are, the great things you have in life. From the Yale happiness course, there was a big section on that. That's been proven scientifically, the importance of gratefulness, right? And so I really take that moment each morning that I've got in a habit, and I just look at, especially my 3.5-year-old right now. He's just in the prime of cuteness.
Oh, it's the best age.
Oh man, and I'm just like, dude, you're never gonna be this cute again. I'm gonna just suck up every second, and I just grab him and I just hug him, and we play and I tickle him, and that is just, I mean, that just starts my morning off so well, right? I'm enjoying it. Whereas, right, if I tried to put in too many things that I didn't really enjoy, then I like the way you said the algorithm would fall apart.
Yeah.
Okay, last, let's talk about flow. Tell me about your definition and how you would use flow.
Well, the way that I understand it from the way that Csikszentmihalyi taught it is it's essentially, in terms that are, make it relatable instead of using jargon, is essentially that sweet spot between enjoying that we do have some mastery over a particular domain and then not being bored with regards to that growth. I'll use your terminology instead of sort of learning jargon, right? So we know that when we're really sort of enjoying that component of having this autonomy and mastery over a domain, and then also feeling kind of at the edge of invigoration because we're like, oh my goodness, there's still things to learn here, that becomes this sweet spot in our brain where we sort of let time dissolve, right? So not only are we really enjoying ourselves and engrossed in that particular activity, but our mind doesn't wander because we're so hyper-focused on what we're doing. And so it goes back to where I said, an important component of fun is that connection we have with something else. So it's clear that we just really tap into, the fact that we're connected with whatever we're doing. And it creates this bond that, whether you're metaphysical or not, clearly transcends time, at least our perception of time. And it's a beautiful place to be. Csikszentmihalyi has made a fairly strong argument that when we're able to create an environment where that thrives, there's a whole host of psychological and physiological benefits.
Totally agree. Now, how can somebody find that, right? Somebody saying, okay, great, but how do I get into flow? How do I figure out what my flow is and where to find it and get in and stay there?
So it's clear that it comes from a path of mastery, right? So you want to figure out what it is that you are trying to get better at, and so how can you engage in that activity? Whether, for me it's writing, I'll start to kind of, get into it, and all of a sudden like 4 hours will pass, and it's because I have that relationship between, my intellect and the page. But for others, it might be a physical activity. It sounds like you probably experienced some of it playing basketball, right? Like where those 2 hours, you're like, wait, what? 6 o'clock, And so to begin to have that accessible to you really requires figuring out what it is that lights you up, right? So that you can create that relationship. It's really hard to find flow at the onset of a new activity because there's so much things that we need to learn, right? It does appear clear that what we call deliberate practice is required, right? So it's going to require at least a little bit of upfront work so that you develop that type of mastery where you are proud of yourself. Well, proud is the wrong word, but that you feel this connection to the thing that you're doing. And once you do, then there's that playful space, right, between being not scared because you're like, holy cow, this is super overwhelming, versus being bored because you're so good at something, that you're just like, okay, right? And so it's that,
right?
Yeah,
so you want
exactly.
to incorporate your strengths and your passions, but if it's too, right, I think I remember James Clear talking something about this in his book, but if it's too easy, then it's not fun. And if it's too unattainable or too hard, then that's also, it's got to be in that sweet spot of just hard enough and just pleasurable enough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So in emotional science, again, I didn't want to geek people out on jargon, but it's easier for me to say it using jargon.
Please
so now that we clunked through it, but what we call it arousal, right? And so essentially when we're too aroused, right, like, we feel like the situation is so complex that we might not get through it, or we don't have the skill set to be able to achieve what we're trying to achieve. We get anxious, right? That's not a fun space to be in, and it really keeps us in the moment because we realize that encoding as much information as possible and kind of learning takes us out of that ability to have that intimate relationship with it. the same goes with low arousal, right? Like if we're not being stimulated at all and we're not using the aspects of mastery, towards that craft or activity, then we get bored, right? Like, oftentimes for whatever reason, in the literature, tennis players are brought up maybe because they've been studied, but a masterful tennis player like Serena Williams playing someone like me, after an hour, she's going to be like, what am I doing here, right? That's not going to get her into a state of enjoying her time. And so, again, it becomes that kind of sweet spot of arousal where you're really enjoying what you're doing, and at the same time, there's elements that are challenging you enough that you're not getting bored.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, right, anybody that plays sports can immediately just think about if you've ever played a sport and you've been in a group. So for me, for instance, I did this thing in the Northwest, in the Midwest. It's called paddle. Do you know what paddle is? Paddle tennis?
I'm not familiar.
A lot of people aren't. I didn't know until I moved here 6 years ago, but it's a huge thing in the winter. It's like basically outdoor tennis in the winter. You're wearing like gloves and hats. It's kind of crazy, but very addictive. It's awesome.
Is it an
once you get into
offshoot of pickleball that's just like kind of blowing up everywhere too?
It's just very similar to pickleball, but you can actually, it's more of a tennis ball and you can hit it off. It's more physical. You're hitting it off the screens and stuff. But anyways, my first year, they put me on the team with like all the new people. And like, I'd say only about, I played tennis in high school, so I had some tennis skills, and not to sound like just better than everybody else, but a lot of the people's skills were not where mine were. And I hated practicing with them. I was just like, this is so pointless and this is so boring. I'm not getting better. Like, they're not hitting it back to me. We're not getting any rallies, right? And then it worked itself out. The next season, I got onto a better team and with people more with my skill level. And our practices were so fun because everybody was right in that same kind of zone where sometimes I'd win, sometimes they'd win. And it was just this, this ABG of kicked in, of this competitive, like, oh, I want to get better and better and better, and I want to beat this person all the time, and I want to be able to beat the series, they call them series, and the lower series, the better. I want to be able to beat the series 10 guys next year type of thing.
There you go.
So, yeah, totally get that, and that makes total sense, right? Versus, any sport where you're just, you mentioned tennis, kind of similar, that's what made me think of it. If you're not playing competitive, a partner that's competitive, like, you're bored.
Yeah, and like, so even for a solo sport, right, for the introverts that are listening, like something like rock climbing, right, like once you get to a certain stage, climbing up boulders at the beach, ultimately, especially if you feel a real connection to, mastering that skill, it might be enjoyable, but you're not necessarily going to reach flow, right, to, things like overhead climbs that are just, you're literally scared for your life. You're not going to find flow there either, right? Until you get to that level, and then you might. So that's I think that's the real specialness of that in particular. Again, it's such a great place to be because oftentimes transcendence can live there. We realize we lose the need to make sense of the world because we're really just in that spot where, like, I get this. Like, I don't need to add any more context to this particular activity. And our brain slows down. That's why we think there's, some of the psychological benefit comes down because so much of our angst is like, what does that mean? What does that mean? How does that apply to me? And like when you're in a state of flow, again, it's, some people describe it as a beautiful dance, right? Because you don't need to add any context. You've got it. One of the analogies I bring up in the fun habit is this quote I love from science that the map isn't the territory, right? When we're able to access those flow states, well, let me provide context to that quote. It essentially means that, like, when we're learning something new, all we have is a map, but the map is never completely representative of the territory, right? The map can get you to A to B, but it doesn't mean you know the city, right? You don't know where the best restaurants are. You don't have friends in the city. It's essentially just a way to take a linear path to where you need to go. And so, like, and it goes back to what you were saying, like any study, any piece of advice, it's a map, take it as such, but there's probably better ways once you learn,
right.
Once you get into it. And so the same thing goes with flow. Like, you don't need the map anymore. You can throw it out because you're so familiar with the territory. You're just in it. Like, this is your spot. This is your hometown, using those metaphorically, of course.
I love it. Well, this has probably been the longest interview I've done in a very long time.
I'm sorry about that.
well, there's nothing to apologize about. Anybody, right, that has stayed through the whole thing understands why it went long. I mean, I could geek out on this stuff forever and ever, and just keep using more. I love that you're just a wealth of studies and examples, because that's something that's missing from a lot of my guests, is like having that, not just saying something, but being able to back it up with, this is where it came from, and this is who said it, and this is, the scientific term. So thank you, Mike, so much for coming on the show. I was able to work through and figure out, I love when I learn and grow. Funny how that works. And I was able to learn some stuff and grow on this call. So thank you very much. This was amazing.
I appreciate that. I can't wait for you to dig in the book. I take a lot of wisdom from a game designer, amazing game designer by the name of Alex Mandrake, and I think you'll like that too. Especially given your vibe. So
yeah, I have the Amazon cart open right now. I was just reading about the book, and I am buying now with one click. Done.
Thanks so much. I appreciate this.
Just happened. Just happened, people. Here, look. Don't believe me? There it is.
I believe you.
Anyway, so yeah, and I want to connect again. I want to talk a little bit more about some synergy with us and the stuff we're working on. So I'll reach out to you on DM. We'll schedule a call maybe the next week or two.
Sounds awesome.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys, for tuning in, everybody. Appreciate it. So I didn't get to everybody's questions. Thanks, Dr. Kelly Kessler. I know there were some other questions. I saw
you can hit us up on DM.
Exactly. Hit us up on DM. All right. Take care, everybody.
That's it for the Gamify Your Habits podcast with Will Moore. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to visit moremomentum.com to learn how you can gamify your life.